95% of our chips are made 9,000 miles away. That doesn't sound good. And by the way, it's 80 miles from mainland China. So and the Chinese have said, we're going to take Taiwan. Like, they're not even shy about it. So we need to make our own chips.
The single biggest point of failure for the U.S. economy and for the Western economies, 99% of high-value chips are made on the island of Taiwan. So we're trying to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the U.S. We're trying to bring steel production back to the U.S. We're bringing pharma back to the U.S. under President Trump's leadership. There's a group of us in the cabinet, in the White House, who believe if we have not de-risked the U.S. economy and brought these industries back on shore when we walk out the door in January 2029, we will have failed, and we are not going to fail.
Trump says Taiwan should move half its chip empire to America. Taiwan says no. Why does that matter? Because 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan. The chips inside your iPhone, NVIDIA GPUs, cloud servers, even the Pentagon's next-generation weapons. If war, blockade, or disaster hit the island, America's tech economy could freeze overnight. Washington calls this dependence a nightmare and a security concern for America. Taiwan calls it the Silicon Shield. Its role in chips makes conflict too costly for everyone. So Trump's team reached for the same lever they've used everywhere else: tariffs. Threaten 100% taxes on Taiwanese chips unless fabs and jobs move to U.S. soil. In simple terms, move a big chunk of your semiconductor empire to the United States, or pay a heavy price at the border. On TV, it sounds tough. Make them pay. Bring the factories home. But here's the illusion. Tariffs don't teleport clean rooms to Arizona. They raise costs first for U.S. consumers and industries, cloud computing, automakers, electronics, long before they force Taiwan to budge. However, Taiwan did something unexpected. It didn't shout, it didn't slam the table, it quietly refused to be treated like a subcontractor in someone else's empire. Picture this. Walmart shelves where every phone, car, and laptop carries a hidden tariff tax. That's not liberation. That's a bill handed quietly to Americans themselves. Now, it only gets complex. This is a story of how the U.S. is trying to sideline China from the world's chips, and how Taiwan is trying just as hard not to be sidelined itself. First, the stakes. Tiny Taiwan is a giant in one thing: manufacturing the world's most advanced semiconductors. TSMC, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, Taiwan's leading chip maker, produces most of the world's cutting-edge semiconductors, the chips that drive U.S. iPhones, NVIDIA graphics cards, cloud servers, and advanced military systems. Analysts routinely estimate that more than 90% of the world's most advanced chips are etched in Taiwanese clean rooms. That creates a nightmare scenario in Washington. If a war, blockade, or even a major earthquake hit the island, huge parts of the U.S. tech economy and the Pentagon's future weapons could be frozen overnight. So both the Trump and Biden administrations have shared a core objective: reduce that single point of failure, keep China away from cutting-edge chips, and bring some of that production onto U.S. soil. Trump's version of this strategy leans on the same tools we've seen in his other deals: tariffs, pressure, and public ultimatums. By 2025, his team was floating some aggressive ideas. According to coverage summarized by outlets like Ars Technica, Trump allies talked up the notion that Taiwan should move as much as 50% of its chip production to the United States. Taiwanese officials didn't wait to see if that number would harden into policy. The island's vice premier publicly said there was no such commitment and called that scale of relocation unrealistic, a polite but firm rejection of the fantasy that half of TSMC could simply be shipped to Arizona overnight. At the same time, Trump advisors explored tariffs as a stick. Policy papers and think tank analyses describe proposals for tariffs as high as 100% on Taiwanese semiconductors unless more fabs and jobs move to the U.S. the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, a tech policy group in Washington, warned that such tariffs would backfire, raising costs for U.S. electronics and chip designers, while doing little to force an actual relocation of manufacturing. So you had the outline of a bargain. America wants fewer chips made in a place China considers its own. It wants more chips made in America by companies like TSMC. And it's willing to use access to the U.S. market, via tariffs, as leverage. But Taiwan has its own red lines. TSMC doesn't exist in a vacuum. Its advantage comes from a dense local ecosystem, tool suppliers, specialty chemicals, engineers, and a talent base that has grown around Hsinchu and other science parks for decades. Moving half of that ecosystem is not like moving a single factory. It's closer to uprooting a small country inside a country. Taiwanese strategists also talk about the Silicon Shield, the idea that the island's central role in the global chip supply chain gives the US, Europe, and even China themselves a strong interest in avoiding war. Hollow out that advantage too far, and Taiwan becomes easier, not harder, to pressure. So instead of giving in, Taipei played a slower, more tactical game. TSMC had already agreed, under earlier US pressure and subsidies, to build advanced fabs in Arizona, backed by CHIPS Act incentives. Estimates put the broader U.S. investment framework at roughly $40 to $65 billion over time, with plans for multiple plants rather than a single showpiece. That's cooperation. But on Taiwan's scale, it's still a slice, not a transplant. Reporting cited by Fox Business and U.S. News says Trump's team leaned into this path, negotiating a trade package where Taiwanese chipmakers would expand their U.S. presence and help train American workers to run those fabs. The idea was to convert some of Taiwan's engineering know-how into U.S. industrial capacity, classrooms and clean rooms, not just cargo ships. In parallel, the U.S. tightened controls on China. Export control rules, built under Trump and expanded under Biden, bar TSMC from supplying Huawei with its most advanced chips, and restrict the sale of leading-edge manufacturing equipment into China. Policy reports from security think tanks like the Stimson Center describe this as a dual strategy: keep China 1 or 2 generations behind at the cutting edge, and pull some of the non-Chinese capacity closer to home in the US and allies such as Japan. That puts Taiwan in a vice. On one side, it relies on the US for security guarantees and high-value customers. On the other, it trades heavily with China and lives 130 kilometers from the mainland coast. Given these complexities, how has Taipei responded to Washington's harder tariff talk? First, they've drawn a clear line against forced relocation. Taiwanese officials repeatedly stressed that decisions about where to build fabs would be made based on commercial logic and national interest, not on ultimatums from any capital, whether Washington or Beijing. Statements covered by Taiwan News and France 24 emphasized cooperation, helping industry cope if tariffs hit, but stopped well short of endorsing a huge one-time shift of production. Second, by weaponizing friction instead of confrontation. Policy analysis from Taiwanese institutes describes how the government uses phased financing, state bank oversight, and careful contract structures to slow-walk any commitments it sees as risky. Investments can be stretched over a decade, linked to permit approvals, or limited by yearly caps. This legal structuring transforms Washington's demand to move half your industry now into Taiwan's reply. We'll reassess the next expansion in 3 years. It's a cautious, conditional strategy that ensures Taiwan keeps control of the pace and terms. Third, by leaning into diversification rather than dependence. Taiwan has welcomed TSMC's new projects in Japan and Europe, not just the US, spreading risk across multiple friendly jurisdictions instead of making itself a captive supplier to a single market. That keeps the Silicon Shield global rather than bilateral. So, where does China fit in this picture? Beijing has poured money into its own chip sector, but US export controls have made it difficult to catch up at the very top end. Chinese fabs can produce many types of chips, but the ultra-dense logic chips used in advanced AI and military hardware still come largely from Taiwan and South Korea. From Washington's perspective, that's an opportunity and a vulnerability at the same time. It's an opportunity because if TSMC doesn't ship its best designs to Chinese customers, the US and its allies maintain a technological edge. That's why the Trump and Biden administrations both pressured TSMC to comply with US sanctions and licensing rules on Chinese firms. But it's a vulnerability because the fabs are sitting in the very place US war planners worry about most, an island Beijing has vowed to unify, by force if necessary. That's the real driver behind the Trump-era talk of tariffs and relocation. From the outside, it looks like an argument over trade. Underneath, it's a scramble to redraw the map of global power. Now let's flip into the deeper layer, the trade economic view. On the surface, Trump's semiconductor rhetoric fits the same pattern as his broader tariff strategy: threaten painful taxes on imports, then offer to dial them back in exchange for jobs, investment, and political wins at home. The master narrative is simple: we will make them pay. They need our market, we don't need theirs. We can force factories to move. But chips don't behave like t-shirts. Think tank studies like the ITIF report point out the basic arithmetic. A 100% tariff on Taiwanese chips wouldn't magically teleport fabs to Ohio. It would double the cost of critical inputs for US tech firms, invite retaliation on US exports, and push global companies to route production through third countries or redesign products to avoid the tariff code altogether. In other words, the punishment lands first on downstream US industry, cloud computing, consumer electronics, automakers, long before it threatens TSMC's survival. That's why those analysts call the tariff plan self-defeating. It tries to use a blunt weapon against a highly complex multi-country supply chain. There's a deeper illusion here. The idea that the US can force Taiwan to uproot half its chip-making rests on an old imperial script. Master issues an order. Client state restructures its economy to comply. But Taiwan isn't a colony. It's a swing sovereign, militarily dependent in some ways, but economically central enough to shape the rules of the game. So instead of playing the obedient subcontractor, Taipei plays 3 cards at once. 1. The security card. Stay firmly aligned with the US on defense and on keeping advanced know-how out of China. That makes it hard for Washington to punish Taiwan without punishing its own strategy against Beijing. 2. The ecosystem card. Insist that the highest-end nodes, suppliers, and R&D stay clustered at home, where they work best, and preserve the silicon shield. 3. The friction card. Use contracts, timelines, and multi-country diversification to turn ultimatums into negotiations. The result is not open rebellion, but controlled resistance. TSMC builds in Arizona, but keeps its most advanced processes rolling out first in Taiwan. Taiwan trains US workers, but trains its own even faster. The US gets some reshoring headlines, but not enough to sever Taiwan's centrality. At the same time, Washington's attempt to sideline China from the chip ladder is very real. Export controls, investment screening, and pressure on TSMC and its peers are all designed to keep Chinese firms from accessing the tools, equipment, and design services they need to match US capabilities. That's the one arena where Trump, Biden, and much of Congress quietly agree. But here's the paradox. To keep China down, the US needs Taiwan up, robust, technologically ahead, and willing to cooperate. Push too hard with tariffs and relocation demands, and you risk weakening the very partner that makes your China strategy viable. So the Taiwan-Trump chip story is really a triangle. The US wants to cripple China's access to the most advanced chips and reduce its own dependence on a conflict zone island. China wants to erode that dependence by building its own capability and, in the long term, folding Taiwan into its orbit. Taiwan wants to stay indispensable to both, without becoming a pawn of either. That's why Taipei publicly killed the 50% relocation idea. That's why think tank reports warn that brute tariffs on Taiwanese semiconductors would hurt US firms more than they hurt TSMC. And that's why the real growth is in carefully negotiated fabs in Arizona, Kumamoto, and Dresden, not in fantasy maps where half of Hsinchu is simply copied and pasted into the Arizona desert. From a trad economics perspective, the lesson is sharp. Empires can threaten, but in a world of complex supply chains and high-skill clusters, they can't simply command. Tariffs are loud, ecosystems are quiet but stubborn, and masters who think they can order the relocation of an entire technological civilization are learning that allies now answer with something more subtle than yes or no. They answer with, "We'll work with you, on our terms." So the real question isn't whether Trump's tariffs can force Taiwan to move. It's whether America can afford the illusion that tariffs equal control. Would you trust tariffs to protect America's chips? Or is Taiwan's resistance the real shield? Drop your take below. Because in the battle over who controls the world's semiconductors, perspective isn't just opinion, it's leverage. And if you want to keep tracking how those terms are being rewritten, from Tokyo to Taipei, from Riyadh to Detroit, hit subscribe. This is Trad Economics. And in the battle over who controls the world's chips, perspective really is power.